Welcome to Real Estate Focus. I'm Calvin Law. Our topic is home inspection. My guest is Todd Case from Pillar to Post Home Inspection. Todd is here today to share his expertise about home inspection with its pros and cons for having home inspection versus not having home inspection. Thank you for being here, Todd. Welcome.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. I'm glad you asked.
Thank you for driving so long distance to get here. So hopefully, you enjoy the show.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing as well. So welcome.
Thank you.
In a normal real estate transaction where after the buyer have an accepted offer, before the buyer sign the purchase and sale, that's when they need the home inspection done. And that's when they reach out to hire a licensed inspector to perform the inspection before they sign the purchase and sale. And that's when you enter the picture. So with that being said, why inspection is so important for buyers or sellers, especially buyers, if you will?
Well, actually, we have done them for both. More often than not, it is for the buyers than it is for the sellers. But the importance is to find stuff that they're not aware of. Right? Most buyers don't know how a house functions. So our job in general is to inform and educate them on the aspects of the home. There are going to be some defects based on the age of the home and such. I mean, if it's a new home, more often than not, it's a cosmetic defect, whereas in an older home, it might be something a little bit bigger. The mechanicals, the electricals, everything. We look at everything. So the idea is you want to get a home inspector to come in, go through the house, talk to you about what they found, talk to you about the maintenance items and such for future repairs or whatever is needed to make sure that they are comfortable in that home going forward.
Plus, most listing agents and sellers, they could only disclose any material defects that they know. Any unknown material defects, I mean, it's good to find out from the home inspector, right?
Right, and some of them, as an example, I will say, oh, I have this known defect, it was repaired 5 years ago. It might have been repaired 10 years ago. They're trying to just go off of memory because they don't have the actual paperwork in front of them. And that happens,
Right, that's why it's called buyers beware.
Yes.
Yeah. So where do they find licensed inspectors?
All right.
Especially the good ones, right?
So the Commonwealth of Mass says you go on to the professional licensure website and pick one, right? Because they have a license, they're all good, right? And they are. I'm not going to say any one is better than another, right? They all have their own specialties and so on. The best way that I tell people is you can go on like ASHI website, Internachi website. Those are two associations that members are part of. The other is talk to your friends, talk to people, family who has been through the inspection process. The realtors are going to have some that they feel are best suited for the buyers, or even the sellers in some instances, right? And so you have a bunch of different ways of finding one. The most important way is once you find one, talk to them. See if your communication skills work well together, and if so, that's the inspector for you.
So you mentioned about the two websites. I mean, how do you spell the name of those two websites?
ASHI is ASHI, American Association, and I'm a member of it.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah,
and the other one is Internachi, INTERNACHI.
Okay, thank you. So what is the duty of a home inspector?
The home inspector's actual job is to inform and educate the buyer on the home. So when he goes in, Mass has the regulations that they need to follow. It's CMR 266. They follow the regs as to looking at the outside. The outside means the property, drainage and such, vegetation around the house, as well as the exterior components of the house. And then from there, they're going to look at the inside. Inside means anything from the roof line down through to the bottom of the basement or crawl space that they can access. That's the most important thing. If it's blocked off, the inspector is not required to move personal items to get to it. So the recommendation is make sure that these spaces are accessible, because those are the hidden areas of the hardest part to find information. And once you find it out later, now you're questioning why wasn't it pointed out previously? Well, because there was a truck in front of it or something like that. You know.
That makes sense. So continuing with the next question, what are the big ticket items that most buyers should look out for?
All right, so the big ticket items, the most important areas, generally speaking, are in the roof, right? The foundation, the attic, and the basement. Those are the 4 areas where you're really going to find the most potential issues. The roof, of course, it's the age of the shingles, the chimney, right? Those are the 2 biggest items as far as the roof is concerned. And the attic, of course, it's the sheathing, because of ventilation, moisture, insulation, and that type of thing. It's the quality of the sheathing. And as well as there may be some mechanical components up there and some wiring. Depending on the age of the house, it might be some really old wiring. So, and then you get down in the basement area, it's very similar. How's the structural support, right? Pest damage, termites, powder post beetle, carpenter ants, and so on. We can't use the term mold unless we're mold certified, but we'll use it in this instance. Mold ends up being one of the bigger ticket items, because of the fact of the amount of moisture could determine, you know, the health issues within that house as well.
I wish we have some pictures about foundation. So especially in a lot of areas where older houses, including new construction as well, I've seen a lot of like crack. You know, it's a difference between like structural crack versus like sediment cracks, and you know, so.
The easiest way for me to explain it, and some people might disagree, I just put my fingers up like this. If it separates like Spock, that's a shrinkage crack. If it separates this way, now you have an issue, right?
You mean back and forth? Okay.
Yep, that means you have a footing issue.
So if the cracks are even, if you will, then the sediment crack.
Yeah, as long as the wall stays even. Now it's going to be off just a little bit. Why? Because it's just the way it is. It's more often than not an easy fix. Getting in a basement dewatering company, you can have a structural engineer come in and look at it, and then we always recommend have that done. But more often than not, they fill it in with an epoxy, and they got a 6 to 10 year warranty.
Right. We're not structural engineers, so basically, based on a lot of cracks that I've seen, is like hairline cracks, cracks less than 1/8 of an inch. I mean, those are sediment crack, right? Yeah.
And you'll see more often than not corners of the windows,
Yep.
right? Through the form ties. So the form ties are those pieces of metal that are sticking, the little holes you see in the foundation itself. That's where the form ties are. And you'll look and you'll see that crack line going through them. Those are very, very common.
Very usual cracks.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you get them on the floor. And if it's not what's called a monolithic pour, that means the floor and the foundation will pour at the same time. The floor itself will have cracks as long as there's no major displacement, meaning potential for missing soil underneath. More often than not, it could easily just be filled in.
So most buyers don't need to freak out, right?
Right, but they're going to anyways, because it's normal. You're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for something, and you want to make sure it's safe.
Especially first-time home buyers.
Yes.
Yeah, right. So, yeah, good to know. How long would it, I know it varies, how long would a normal home inspection take?
It does vary. It varies on the size, number of people. So if you're anywhere from 1,000 square feet to 3,000 square feet, it could take some inspectors an hour and a half to 3 hours, right? Generally speaking, what I tell people is 2 to 2.5 hours more if I don't shut up, right? Because we start talking. When we start talking, it's really all about education, right? The more I talk, the more questions they ask, which is all good because of the fact that I'm not going to live there with them, right? So what they can get up front helps them out in the long run. And a lot of other inspectors do the same thing. I mean, there are a lot of good teaching inspectors out there.
I agree, yeah. It's about education, like you say,
Yes.
you know, and pointing out the pros and cons to them as well.
Yes.
Yeah, because you're not familiar with the property and they're not familiar with the property. And so that's why it's good to be there and ask questions. And
Yeah.
that's the only way to get to know the property better.
Yeah, and sometimes when you get there, and most of us will get there a little bit early. If the neighbor is out, we'll chat. Okay?
Good and bad, right?
Yeah, and a lot of times it works out really, really well because now the neighbor will end up talking to the homeowner, the prospective homeowner, just about things that they know because you know some of them have been there for years and they know more about the property than we can find in a 2 to 3 hour inspection period.
No doubt. So what if major issues arise during home inspection? Do you recommend any specialists to correct them or?
Yes, so what ends up happening is when we're done with our reports, some people will be done with their report on site, some will take a day, some will take a couple of days, depending on the home itself as well as how busy the inspector is, right? They'll go through that and then they'll give the most important items are either in the front or the back of the report, and then that will be discussed between the buyer and their agent. They'll discuss the areas that they think is, you know, needs to be addressed. And yes, so the specified professional, be it a plumber, an electrician, an HVAC guy, a roofing contractor, or even a structural engineer, they'll call them in, whatever they need, just for further evaluation to let them know the extent of the issue. Some of them, they sit there and say, hey, this is an easy fix, right? A one-day job, X amount of dollars. Or some of them could be more extensive, whereas one was $100,000 for a structural repair. So.
Now in Massachusetts, a lot of properties that are not deleted. So do you do deletting as well?
No, so, all right, so
Or lead paint-
talking about
lead paint testing.
lead paint testing. So I leave that to the guys, you know, one of those specified people. I decided not to get into it. And there are some inspectors that do it. I actually, you know, for a while there, I actually made the recommendation of another inspector just to do the lead paint inspection. But then I changed phones, lost his number, and I haven't talked to him since. He's actually a very, very awesome guy too. But there are companies that specify, and that same thing with asbestos, right? And there's another thing, some guys can do asbestos testing. Same thing as sewer scoping. Some guys can do that as well. And I tell people I don't do it. So back when I was young, I used to put in like septic systems. I like them when they're clean. Once they're dirty, I don't need that. That's beyond my expertise.
Let somebody
right?
do the work, yeah, no doubt. So but you do radon testing, right?
We do radon testing. There are other tests as well, that other additional services that we can do, right? So we'll talk about radon first. What is radon? Radon is a decomposition of the radium that's in the bedrock. As it decomposes, it actually goes up into the surface area, so to speak, be it outside or inside. Every property has some level of radon. So the EPA says 4.0 is a threshold where they recommend mitigation. Now they have dropped that down to 2 as their, you know, desired recommendation, but it's still the 4.0 threshold, right? So we go in as inspectors, we'll put in either an electronic monitor or what's called a canister vial system and let it sit. So real estate says let it sit 48 to 96 hours, right? Pick it up. If you're electronic, you have the results right then and there. With the canister vials, it gets shipped off to whatever facility they use, and from there, they'll tell them whether it's above 4.0 or below it, right? And then that's another item where the realtor, you know, for the buyer and the seller, talk about a negotiable.
Or if it's about 4.0, then it is the seller's responsibility to install the mitigation system in the basement.
Not required in the
Not
state of
required.
Mass.
Okay. So the seller doesn't require to do that.
It's not required, but most sellers do take on that responsibility.
Oh, it's good to know.
And so we'll look at other ones, right? Now we'll go to water testing, well water. Now there's radon in water. And of which I just recently did one for a friend of mine. It was extremely high. So in Mass, DEP recommends a treatment system for anything over 10,000 picocuries. Why? Because it's in water. You're not ingesting it through the lungs and everything. It's not as bad in lower quantities. They were well above that. They were shocked.
Wow. Yeah.
So
because each property is different.
yes, yeah,
right.
because I did one that was a mile and a half down the street, and it wasn't even close to their number.
Right. So what is a sump pump? Because a lot of people still don't know what is a sump pump.
All right, sump pump. New construction, you might see what's called a sump pit. And all that is this plastic cover that you see in the foundation, well, in the flooring next to the corner of the foundation. That pit is to try and, if you have groundwater that gets up into the subsurface of the building, right, the basement area, that pit, you would end up putting a sump pump in and pull the water out, right? What that's going to do is that's going to keep your basement drier. So a lot of people will install a sump pump, of which I have to do it at my house. I have to install a second one, only because there's another area in my house that's a different foundation that started taking on water. So it's happened. It's part of owning a home, right? Because you can't control groundwater, right?
And if a basement has sump pump or some pumps, it doesn't mean that the property is in the flood zone.
No, not
Just
necessarily.
for precautionary
Right.
purposes.
Now,
And keep the basement dry.
Now, they could always look on the FEMA map to see if it's in the flood zone.
Yes,
Right.
they do. Yeah, they can.
But you look at groundwater tables change. I mean, it's been dry for a while, and then last night it poured.
It's Mother Nature.
Yes. Yeah. So the groundwater table is going to be a little bit higher today than it was yesterday.
Especially basements sit in the ground.
Yes.
And there are water underneath the ground, underneath the ground, yep, and around the basement as well. So, just for precautionary purposes.
Yeah.
So having sump pump is a good thing.
Yes. Actually, the sump pump with a battery backup is great. Why?
agree.
Because a sump pump doesn't do you any good if you don't have power.
So if you see a sump pump, don't freak you out,
Nope.
So, yep, it's a normal process.
Exactly.
Yeah, right. And there are two types of French drains. One is outside and one is inside. So what is the difference?
All right, so outside is, generally the outside drain is done during construction, right? So it's a lot easier to do it that way than dig up everything after the fact. So and a lot of times what they'll do is they'll actually put the gutter downspouts into that drainage system and take it away. Now it could go into a dry well, which all that is just an area of containment under the ground for that water to dissipate. Or it could run off into a low point in the yard itself. Internally, what the contractor will do is, more often than not, it's a basement dewatering company, will do a saw cut around the internal perimeter of the foundation, put in a drain system that goes to a sump pump, and then sends it out.
Right. That's the legal way to do it.
Yep.
Right. And the last question is that what is the difference between termite versus wood-borne insects?
Well, a termite they're all the same thing, right? Different types. You got like the three biggest ones are the carpenter ants, termites, which are everyone's least favorite, and powder post beetles for the older buildings, right? So the powder post beetles, so what you'll see is a bunch of dart holes in the wood, right? If they're really, really dark, then guess what? That's dead or dormant. If it's really, really light, guess what? Now you got some activity, right? And there is a treatment that can be done. Termites need what's called a mud tube, right? Why? Because termites are translucent. So if they see a lot of sunlight, they burn up and see you later, bye, right? So if you see what looks like a dirt trail on your foundation or something, then most likely you have had termite activity prior or you currently have it, so that you talk to a pest guy. And then the carpenter ants. Carpenter ants just march along and go, hey, guess what? I'm going over to this house, right? They don't need any type of protection or anything. They all do damage to the wood, right? They all eat the inside of the wood material. The other one that you'll see a lot of is carpenter bees. So you'll see a hole about the size of your finger, right, the tip of it, up in, more often than not, in the soffit, rake boards area. And they eat out the inside of the wood. They leave the shell. And that's where they build their colonies and such. These all can be taken care of by a pest person, and yes, depending on the extent of damage, how long they've been there, yes, you're gonna need a contractor to come in and do some repair work.
So the termites would come back, but those wouldn't come back.
Well, they all do.
They all do?
They all do,
Oh,
right? You know,
okay.
so to speak. I mean, if they're in the area, they're, you know, as long
It's their
as there's
home,
a-
right? Pretty
it's-
much.
As long as there's a source,
Yeah.
they're gonna enjoy it, right? It's just, you do preventive maintenance. Once you start it, just make sure that you have someone there that cares about your home and takes care of it. The other one, of course, are rodents. You know, mice. Everyone, oh my gosh, I'm afraid of mice. Look at your fingernail. That's the size hole they need, right? If they want to get in, they're going to get in, right? You just got to do as much preventive maintenance as possible. The same thing with squirrels, bats, and in some areas, raccoons.
Well, it's best to get them treated, you know, every
Yeah.
single year, right?
Yep.
Just for precautionary purposes as well.
And that's what it is. You bring in the people to protect your home. I mean, you don't wait until your car is broken down before you bring it to a mechanic. You do your preventive maintenance along the way. You want to do the exact same thing with your home, right? Take care of it the same way you would your car.
I agree. Well, Todd, thank you so much for being here. And thank you for sharing your expertise with the consumers.
I enjoy it.
Thank
know.
you.
This
I'm
is-
glad you enjoy it. Yeah. Well, I'd love to have you back in the future.
Anytime you ask, I'll be more than happy to come.
Thank you. Thank you. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found the information helpful. Having a thorough home inspection to protect your home or future home is important because it will give you the pros and cons of any issues that you might need to know before you close on the property. So having a licensed contractor or inspector to inspect your home before you close is important. Well, I want to thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you next time.